We welcome you. As many of you know, Dulce is a DACA recipient and an immigration attorney, and also heads up the Border Angels, which is one of the few groups that's really got their feet on the ground in both countries during this pandemic. So we wanted to catch up with her and see both what she's doing in legal cases and in Tijuana. So welcome.
Thank you, everyone. It's good to see some familiar faces. Thanks, always grateful for this space. Appreciated. Buenos dias. Yeah, so just I very briefly, I'm going to talk about the cases just to give some context on why we still have to do this work, and specifically in Tijuana. You might have heard last year there was a bit of celebration when we did win. And by we, I mean like other organizations, not Border Angels, but other legal teams that sued DHS over the implementation of the Remaining Mexico program, which essentially shut down the way that we process people that arrive at our port of entry asking for asylum. So normally the process would be you would have someone show up at the port of entry, present themselves, willing to go through an extreme vetting process. These are very vulnerable people, and they're afraid of returning to their home country. They're fleeing from something. Usually it's violence, and at times it's violence directly from their own government. And when they present themselves at the port of entry, it would be the officers on the ground that would have a ton of discretion on whether they even believe this person, on whether they have the right documentation, whether they think their claim is fraudulent, or they're misrepresenting something. If the person does say that they have a fear of returning to their home country for one of the bases authorized by law, then they would go through an interview process and eventually through a court hearing. If not put in a detention center, they would be granted parole, which means that they would be inside of the US while their case is pending. Since this administration undid all of that and instead shut down the border for asylum seekers, people were left outside of the US on the Mexican side. So when the Exodus arrived in 2018, the US government, instead of welcoming all of these folks, sounded the bells and alarms and politicized this issue and made it seem as if there was some sort of invasion happening, right? There were migrants coming over and we need to stop them. And one of the things that they would say is there's going to be about 2,000 migrants arriving every single day and we have to stop them. And this was their solution, was just essentially close down the border, shut down the program, the asylum protections that were in place, not only in our laws, but also in the treaties that we signed, right? And so we saw approximately over 56,000 migrants that were left in the Mexican side. Well, several organizations, including the Innovation Law, Al Otro Lado, and other organizations sued for this policy. And last year, we thought we had a win in the lower courts, and we celebrated and thought, okay, we're going to finally start to see people be processed through the asylum process as it should be. And instead, the Ninth Circuit said no. We're going to allow DHS to continue to implement this program. And the US government is going to suffer greatly because they don't have capacity to handle 2,000 people a day arriving at our border. And so that was shut down, which meant that people were still stuck in places like Tijuana. And so recently, JFS here locally and other organizations, I think ACLU might be involved on that, but it's the Immigration Defenders Law Center versus Wolf. They just recently filed a lawsuit as well. So there's some hope as this moves along that that they might win this case, but it's not necessarily an easy case or a difficult case, right? There's hope that now with the new administration, hopefully we won't even have to move the cases along. If the new administration decides to reverse Trump's policies, which would include this one, this in the metering process. So in Tijuana, because that's where we're Border Angels does most of the work. In Tijuana, we see right now what this means on the ground. It's that there's thousands of asylum seekers, migrants, and families in Tijuana without the certainty of a roof or a meal, education, access to employment, and what is the most frustrating thing for them is that the court dates keep getting pushed. And they have been, some families there for over a year and a half. When we say shelters, we don't mean nice, fancy, comfy shelters like sometimes we might see on this side of the border. You know, these shelters in Tijuana are vary. When the Exodus in 2018 came, people literally opened up their homes. They turned garages into living spaces. They turned their churches into living spaces. We have tent cities in Tijuana. And so that's how we have about 32 shelters in Tijuana, but they vary. Some of them house only one family because they don't have resources to house more people. And some house hundreds of people, including over 70 children. And so they vary on the type of shelter and type of support that they can offer in Tijuana. Because of this metering policy and this Remain in Mexico policy and zero tolerance, people are sometimes returning back to danger. With the pandemic and the border closing, the courts closed for them as well. And so folks that had an interview date of last month now are seeing an interview date into next year. And so they're even more frustrated because their cases keep getting postponed while things in Tijuana are getting a lot more difficult, with the pandemic a lot more dangerous as well. Again, it's a combination of the lack of support and resources from the Mexican government and the pressure that the Mexican government has received from the US government to act and implement immigration law as well. And so the administration here, Trump, has used other policies like economic policies to pressure the Mexican government for them to also enforce these laws in the southern border of Mexico. And so people trying to cross into Mexico are having a much more difficult time as well. And once they go through this long, difficult, dangerous journey and make it to Tijuana, then they're faced to be in what has been considered by some folks as the most dangerous city in the world, based on murder rate, based on other factors, specifically dealing with, for example, Black trans women might be an even more dangerous place for them, where they don't feel safe. And so that's what the U.S. government is doing. It's not only denying them their rightful claim to asylum, but it's rejecting folks and telling them to wait an indefinite period in Tijuana without any real resources. So those are the cases. Very briefly again, and I'm oversimplifying this, dealing with the MPP program. The other piece to it is also the legislation with the wall. Trump didn't get a big major win like his administration announced, but I feel also, quite honestly, like we didn't get one either, right? Because the wall is still being built. And so even though there was this lawsuit by the Sierra Club and SBCC, the Southern Border Community Coalition, nevertheless, the wall still being built, even though the administration diverted funds from other places that were not designated for the wall, right? So like the pension money, for example. And the court said that they didn't, the court didn't really address whether that was lawful or not. They just said that the government has this authority to continue. So basically they granted the stay. And so there we have Congress saying Trump can't build his wall as it was proposed, and money was not allocated for that. Yet it was okay for Trump to grab some money from elsewhere to continue this project. So that's where we are. This last week, our friends from Armadillos that does search and rescue in the desert, and they had planned to search and rescue here in our Jacumba desert, and invited us Border Angels to go along. And so we had this a few days planned to go do that, and it turns out that they told us we can't search for our people that might have perished there in the desert because they were building the wall, and so they are blasting the area, and so we might never find these folks because in order to build the wall, they need to blast this area where our people may be found, and so we weren't allowed to go through it. A couple of days ago, this week Tuesday, we were there in solidarity with our Kumeyaay friends in Kumeyaay territory, and we wanted to hold a ceremony, and we weren't allowed to go through with our vehicles, and so they told us, well, walk the 7 miles, even though they have their vehicles so that they can go and blast this area, pass through. And so that's some of the challenges that we're facing here locally on this side of the border as well. And I say this because historically, the wall, since it went up, since Operation Gatekeeper and this physical monstrosity went up, people have been funneled to their deaths. And there's a debate whether it was actually done on purpose, whether people factored in that migrants would be so desperate that they would be funneled to their deaths, right? And that's one of the reasons why the wall is not necessarily it's not necessary all through the border, because there are places where it is just too dangerous and people will die. So that's what one of the programs that brings about the need for us to drop water in the desert and supplies. And that's what we have been doing. Despite the pandemic, we've been able every single weekend to go as Border Angels and drop water and supplies like food and during the summer, items that would keep people cool. Now that the temperature is dropping, we're having to drive to provide supplies for the winter. So blankets, gloves, socks, those temporary personal heater, like the little things that you snap and then heats. Last year, we received reports of 3 women dying and freezing to death in the mountains. Those are all results of the policies that are in place. So when we put things like zero tolerance, when we militarize the border, when we put checkpoints 24 hours a day and increase the number of agents on the ground, when we put more drones out there and all of this technology to keep eyes on people, what we do is we keep funneling people to harsher ways to cross. People are still going to be attempting to cross. And when we deny them the rightful claim to asylum, they become so desperate on the other side that they attempt to cross, right? We tell them, no, you can't apply for asylum. You have to wait outside. And they're there a year and a half with their babies. And the desert's right there. And then they hear of somebody successfully crossing and they think, this is my chance. I can do it too. If they did it, I can do it too. And so what we have seen is the pattern of migration has changed a bit. So it's no longer the single male, that person that's crossing. We see more and more evidence that it's families that are crossing. We see little kids' backpacks, little kids' shoes, diapers. We see women hygiene products, women underwear. And we can only imagine what it's like for these folks to cross in 120-degree weather, because that's what it gets like in the desert. 120-degree where the shoes are melting. I have personally walked half a mile in 120-degree weather, and I experienced immediately signs of dehydration, and it became a matter of body over mind at that point. And I was coming from a comfortable place, fully rested, and I made the mistake of having coffee that morning. I shouldn't have had coffee, but we come from a very comfortable place. These folks are in this journey for days as they go through the desert, not 1 hour, not one day, but for days. And you can only imagine what it's like to carry a gallon of water or enough supplies for food and drink, and then your 5-year-old, your 7-year-old with you. And that's what we're seeing, because people are so desperate. It's either them trying to cross through a river, like we saw last year with the toddler and her father drowning in our river, and having people that are so desperate die in our rivers and even oceans. We're getting reports of people that are calling our office and saying, my brother from Cameroon was supposed to cross through the ocean, and we don't know where he's at. And there's just no way for us to know unless DEA picked him up, unless the Coast Guard picked him up, or Border Patrol, or someone in the system has them. And when the family can't find them, when there's no charges filed or anything like that, there's no way for us to know what happened with that person. And unfortunately, the kinds of calls that we received have increased. Last year, I don't remember last year getting any call like that. And this year, we definitely did receive calls from people saying, my brother should have been here already, and he's not. And all we can do is just pray for that person at that point. And those are the circumstances that both the US and Mexican government have created. And not only that, but when you hear people saying do it the right way, and then you have people that are doing it the right way, we put them in a detention center for doing it the right way, right? We have people that cross through 13 different countries. They come from Cameroon. We've had people from Ethiopia, from Ghana, from all over Africa come with visible signs of torture. We had a man that came in with 3rd-degree burns, and his family had burned alive and barely made it by miracle. What we did was put him in a detention center, a federal prison that is owned by private corporations that profited every single day from that person sleeping on that bed. So this administration, from day one of the things it did was increase the number of beds so that they could have more people housed in these detention centers. So we created this system where we have private corporations benefiting from the torture that we implement on these folks. And not only that, but when the pandemic happened, we kept them in quarantine, knowing that there were other people that could possibly expose them to COVID-19. Because we created this incentive where the private corporation didn't necessarily rush to provide masks or any kind of PPE protection. We heard excuses of, oh, we can't give them antibacterial gel because they might use the alcohol for drinking. We can't give them masks because there's just not enough supply. And they wouldn't even take the masks that we presented and took ourselves to their doorstep. They wouldn't even take those. And what we did see was instead in these what they called cohorts or units, where we had 100 people sleeping in these different units, lock them down on them and just left them there to hopefully not die, right? Oh, I don't know what they were hoping for, but I was definitely hoping that they wouldn't die. And we couldn't post bonds for them. We were willing and able to post bonds for people, and they told us they couldn't because they had to remain in quarantine. And every single day that they were there in quarantine, the corporation was profiting. Core Civic was making money off of these folks for every single day that they're there. So we created the incentive by putting ownership and responsibility to these private agents over these people. And every time that there's a violation inside, whether it's harassment, which we have received reports of, whether it's even derogatory terms that they're being called, whatever it may be, These are private agents that are being held accountable, quote unquote, by ICE. Then no one holds accountable ICE. ICE is not being held accountable for any of these things that are happening in these detention centers. So that's the system that we've created. And so when we say, abolish ICE, which is maybe something you might have heard, that these are the issues that we're talking about. The whole system that we've created, the incentive that we've created, is to dehumanize people, not to treat them as they should be treated, as people. And not only that, but the most vulnerable people that we have we have encountered. Like, we've had a woman, her baby was killed in front of her, her husband was killed in front of her, and her dad was killed in front of her. She made it by miracle through many countries, through a difficult journey, presented herself, and we put her in a detention center. And then we asked for thousands of dollars to get her out. Thousands of dollars. I mean, as an undocumented person, it's difficult to save one single dollar here in the US, right? We're going through a pandemic. Like, who has $5,000 right now saved up that they can put in for a family member? That's how much money we're asking from these folks. We're asking asylum seekers that literally come with nothing on their backs to pay a ransom, $7,500, $10,000. We've had bonds placed for $18,000, $20,000, $30,000 from an asylum seeker with zero criminal history, going through an extreme vetting process, and really absolutely no reason why ask somebody for $18,000. And it's done so in a very arbitrarily way. And that's why we created this bond program. I didn't imagine that it would become this dire. This need would become so great to have this bond program, because we didn't anticipate a pandemic. And so when we started in January, this program, January 7 was the very first bond that we placed. We thought it would be primarily migrants that were here in the US that were being victims of these raids by ICE here on this side of the border. Well, it turns out that 59 of the bonds that we've placed have been for asylum seekers. And as the pandemic moved along, the amount that they were asking of us increased. And it's no coincidence that when it's Black folks, the amount is higher. It's not a coincidence that these officers arbitrarily are assigning these bond amounts higher for Black people. And that's the pattern that we've seen. And the majority of the folks that we've bonded out have been from African countries. These folks, the officers have the authority and the discretion to have them sign under their own recognizance. They can sign a promise to go to court and show up to court. And the data shows that people do show up to court. Asylum seekers do show up to court. And not only that, but we slap them after they pay thousands of dollars. We slap them with a bracelet, a GPS tracker on them. And so we know what they're up to all the time. And there's really no need to hold anyone for 6 months in a detention center just because they can't pay the ransom. And so that's one of the other programs that we have. We have this immigration bond program. We also have our shelter program. And right now we're supporting about 12 shelters in Tijuana. Again, some of them varied from housing one family to housing hundreds of people. And recently, one of the difficulties that they have been enduring is having to pay the Mexican government the water, because some of them thought that they had that they were going to get waivers from the Mexican government. It turns out that the Mexican government is working with a private company for water, and they're getting charged for that. And so even something as simple as water, they're not getting support from the Mexican government. And so these folks, again, some of them are denied the ability to enroll their kids in education in school. So you have all these kids in these shelters without access or ability to enroll in schools. So last year we collaborated with another organization to provide a mobile school home that went around from shelter to shelter. Given the pandemic, unfortunately, we haven't been able to do our caravan of love, where we would line up the cars. Last summer, every weekend where every other weekend we would line up dozens of cars, fill them up with donations, and then take them across the border. This year, because of the pandemic, we weren't able to do that. The border is closed, and so every time we cross something in a small little discreet car, don't tell the Mexican government we're doing this, but we run the risk that they might stop the car and not let us through. So it's really just essential travel that is allowed right now. So we don't have volunteers, and to not expose these shelters as well that are lacking resources to COVID-19. We are very discreet in the donations that we provide in kind, but we are supporting monetarily these shelters and assessing often what their needs are. And so we've been able to provide for some of them refrigerators, stoves. It's kind of I don't want to say funny, but to an extent cruel to tell them disinfect everything and keep everything neat and clean because of COVID-19 when they don't have a washer or dryer and they're depending on the sun to dry clothes. So we bought stoves and refrigerators and washers and dryers for a lot of these shelters, and they have just been super grateful that at least they have a little bit to be able to control the pandemic and to cook warm meals for the people that they're housing. So that's the shelter program. Again, this is directly related to those cases. We are going to be asking, demanding, and holding accountable this new administration from day one to pressure them to reopen the border again for asylum seekers, to not re-traumatize them and re-torture them, and not make the circumstances so that when there's desperation in Tijuana, that they feel that the best chance is going through the desert. That should never be the case. With the increased militarization, they're having to walk around an extra 10 miles to go and avoid the increased militarization. And so that's why we have seen an increase of deaths and death reports and calls this last year and a half, almost 2 years, with this administration. We also have our Green Card for Kids program. That one is for in collaboration with the county of Riverside, that does not provide an immigration lawyer for the kids that they have in custody. These kids are kids that have been either abandoned, abused, or neglected by one or more of the parents, and then may therefore qualify for something called special immigrant juvenile status, which will then provide them eventually, hopefully, a green card, and then eventually citizenship. And so we partner up with an amazing immigration lawyer, Fabiola Navarro, here in San Diego, to work with the Riverside County. These children are children that are in the custody already of the county. And the county provides social workers, but they don't provide immigration lawyers. So we filled in that gap by providing legal representation for them. And in doing that, we realized that there are 2 children that might have already qualified for citizenship, and they just didn't know it, right? Through one of the parents that had abandoned them. So it's interesting to see these kids finally have some clear pathway to hopefully remaining here in the U.S. lawfully. It's just despicable what this U.S. government's doing, this federal government, because they have actively pursued removal of these kids by giving them a notice to appear in court and attempt to deport these kids. And we're using resources to provide notifications to these kids to deport them back to their home countries, even though now they're in their system and now they're here and they've been part now of our community. The U.S. government is actively seeking to deport them. And so that's why it's, again, a need for us to provide an immigration lawyer that is actually able to fight their cases. So that's just very briefly some of the programs. I want to thank everyone from that saw our flyer with Border Angels and logged in for this call. Please follow us on our website. I can go ahead and drop the website here, but I'm willing to take any questions that people may have. I also have the links to the cases. If anyone wants the links, I can go ahead and drop them in here.
What about DACA? What's happening?
Oh yeah, thank you. So on the eve of elections, we filed our amended complaint because exactly a year ago, wait, is today the 12th? Yeah,
Yes.
a year ago, exactly. We were in front of the Supreme Court. Again, we took our case. We won at the lower court in San Francisco. We won at the Ninth Circuit level. And then we went to the Supreme Court exactly a year ago to argue our case. And this was our case here in California with the 6 individuals, including myself, was consolidated with a ton of other lawsuits across the nation. You know, there were so many support, hundreds of briefs filed in support of DACA recipients, cities, the city of San Jose, the state of California. You know, there was all these organizations in support. And a year ago, we were in front of the Supreme Court and they heard argument on our case. One of the arguments was the APA violation, that the government didn't follow the rules for dismantling the DACA program. And so that was an administrative procedure violation. And from there on, we have been living with so much uncertainty leading up to the day that they announced that we had won the case, June 18 this year, 2020. The opinion came out, and sure enough, we won. Right? We celebrated for like a day. And then the next month, this administration, this president dismantles the program again. And they have cut our work permits from 2 years to 1 year. We were looking forward to travel because since Trump took away the program in 2017, we hadn't been able to travel at all, even though we had wins along the way. We weren't able to restore what's called advanced parole. And we were seeing our family members die across the border without the ability to go say goodbye, without hugging them one last time, and watching the funerals by Skype, if at all, because not everywhere internet was available. And we had hopes that when we won our case in front of the Supreme Court, that we would have been able to travel. And I was really looking forward to going to the shelters and seeing for myself, because I can't go, you know, everything's been remotely. And so I was looking forward to lending a hand in the shelters. And then Trump took that away again this year. And now after 30 years in this country, I still can't travel, and it's just frustrating. But there is they did carve out an exception, and that's for humanitarian reasons, and the officer has discretion to determine whether there's enough evidence to consider it a crucial situation where somebody does need to travel for a humanitarian reason. But we used to be able to travel. DACA recipients could do a semester abroad for educational purposes before Trump took DACA away. Well, that's no longer the case. And so that's why we were looking forward to a new administration that could work with us, at the minimum, restore DACA, which is something that has been promised to us by this new administration coming in, and really look forward to a path to citizenship and something permanent, so that we're not in the same place later down the road. And obviously that's going to depend on what happens on the Senate, but at the minimum, the protection of DACA should lay within this president's power. So that's what we're looking forward to. But as of today, no new applications for people that have never applied for DACA. So those kids that had their already application in hand after they heard that we won our case, I found myself crying with them, you know, because they had everything ready to file, their filing fee, their application ready to go, and then Trump took that away as well. So they have been looking forward to the new administration coming in, so that they can finally have some sort of resolve. We had over 100,000 people graduate last year from high school without any protection from deportation, without DACA, without nothing. And so there they were planning their future, figuring out where to go to college without a valid social security number, without being able to jump on a plane and travel with the freedom that I have today with DACA. And so that's going to be a game changer for so many people's lives coming in January. But obviously, that's just the beginning, right? That's something that can be done on day one as we move forward to a path to citizenship.
Okay, I will send with the notes a link to MPI that has written up a paper about what Biden might do and could do, and how many hoops he has to go through to do it. But do you have any comments on that?
On the ability of this administration to implement something like passing a law protecting us permanently?
Yeah. Or
Yeah, it's gonna
changing immigration.
Yeah, so many things are changing in DC. So I've been personally to DC a few times, and one of the things that even someone from the Hispanic caucus once told me, as we were initially fighting for path to citizenship after the rescission of DACA, was Latinos don't vote. The last time we tried to do immigration reform, we lost seats, right? Well, we changed that, right, with this most recent election. And I think one of the takeaways is that you really have to recognize and honor the Black vote and the Latino vote, right? And you can't just dismiss us anymore. And so I think that has changed the dynamics now. And I think I can, with my chin higher, walk into Congress and demand something, knowing that we do turn up, that those of us that are just disenfranchised have mobilized people, have organized people, have registered people to vote in key places like Arizona. We saw that. And with the Black vote in Georgia. And so, they can't dismiss us as they were before, both sides of the aisle. Definitely Republicans would not even open the door to us. So Mitch McConnell's office was never accessible to us ever. But even some more moderate Democrats, comfy Democrats, even those that we see as allies, that were just comfortable in their seats, now recognize that they do have to step up and do something for us, that it's no longer about being complacent with with the lack of protections for us. And so I think that has changed, and that's what's giving me hope. I am not naive. I know that everything really does hang on in Georgia's election coming up. With that one seat in the Senate, it's going to determine a lot. But we know at the minimum, I expect that we won't have the constant attacks as we were seeing with this administration. The last 4 years have been unbearable. Talk about, on a personal level, weight gain, loss of hair, loss of sleep. You were asking me, like, sleep earlier. Forget. I'm looking forward to sleeping something in the next year, and I can already start to feel my hair regrowing. So it was a personal attack on her. I would have reporters call me and tell me, "Can you give me a statement on what the president just tweeted?" And then he would tweet like 4 things attacking our community, like 4 different things, whether it was public charge or asylum or raids or, DACA or there was always constant attacks on our community the last 4 years. I'm not saying things were peachy and pink before this administration. Obviously it was not. And my own family, and I had my brother in a detention center before this administration. I had my mom go through the removal process before this administration. I've heard the words, "I'm ordering you removed," on my family's cases before this administration. But the constant attack was at a whole nother level. It was exponential with this administration. And I mean, even attacking the DACA program, which made so much economic sense and had so much support nationwide, it just made no sense to undo it. And I was told no politician would commit suicide by attacking DACA, and then here we are. So I'm looking forward to those changes, whether Biden can actually pass legislation. It's going to depend on the final composition in Congress. but I know at the minimum we will have some sort of relief, and I'm hoping that we won't have thousands of asylum seekers in Tijuana, and that the number of deaths from people crossing the deserts or the oceans is going to reduce, and that Mexico won't feel so pressured to implement immigration laws for the US to be an extension, another arm of these cruel policies. And so I'm hoping that Mexico is also celebrating that they don't feel like they're being coerced into doing this as well. Because we saw the military along the border in Tijuana gather people and ask them for their papers in Tijuana, right? These are people that were in the MPP and waiting for their asylum case in this side of the border. They were in Tijuana being questioned by military looking officers with long arms. It's very heavily militarized along the border, and Trump is the one that's pressuring the Mexican government to do this. And so I think we're going to see some sort of relief on both sides of the border.
Good. Are your attorneys volunteers, or are you paying them?
We definitely pay the lawyer helping us with the Green Card for Kids program. That it's a paid contract. But we do need a volunteer for employment law. We also offer support for the day laborers on this side of the border. So once a month, we reach out to our folks that are by the Home Depot, the ones that for one reason or another can't secure jobs. And we offer immigration consultations as well as employment law support, because, sometimes they work all day and then the person doesn't want to pay them because, they threaten them to call ICE on them. But we need an employment law attorney right now. We're lacking support. The attorney that we had is no longer able to support us at the moment. But you just reminded me, Beryl, some of these folks, because one of the things that Trump is doing is it also told these asylum seekers, once they do make it on this side of the border, once they are released from detention, as they move through their case, some of them would be able to qualify for a work permit. Well, that's no longer the case because this president, with the excuse of protecting American jobs, decided to take away the employment cards for them. And so now we see more and more asylum seekers from Haiti here locally in San Diego County in these Home Depots. And we see a lot of the racial tensions from people from Central America coming in Haiti because this administration has caused the circumstances where there are less jobs available because the economy shut down essentially for with the pandemic for these kinds of day-to-day jobs. And not only that, but the government took up their ability to apply for an employment card. So we see more and more Haitians by these Home Depots looking for work.
Okay, Velma, did you have a question?
Yeah, well, I think that yes. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay, good. I think Claudia partially answered it in the chat box, but I guess I know a lot of Americans in the United States are are in favor of DACA continuing to protect immigrant children who toward going on a path of citizenship. And my question was, and in a lot of people's minds, the idea with all the homelessness of Americans in the United States here, and the problem that we can't even take care of them, how would we take care of asylum seekers if if asylum seekers were allowed to come into the United States? Most of them do not have money, do not have resources at all, and and who would pay for it? And Claudia, you wrote me back and said that there are a lot of churches that would welcome the asylum seekers, and people from the community would provide the support for the asylum seekers. I think a lot of Americans had this picture that there's going to be this flood of people, and where are they going to go? They're all going to be on the streets, and it's going to be this big problem. And it seems to me that there's a need for educating Americans about, so what if, asylum seekers were allowed in the United States? Okay, what is the plan? I think a lot of Americans might be more accepting of that if they knew that there was a plan.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you're right. The there has been cases where we have been, again, ready and willing and able to pay for bonds for folks who have already family members on this side, right? They all have a sponsor that is willing to support them in one way or another. So some of them already have family members that are going to be housing them, and they're willing to work, right? And but then we take away their ability to get a work permit. Like, as I just mentioned, this administration in its brilliant mind decided to do that when they're willing to work. And this idea that it's an invasion, or that there are too many people coming over, is just false. This is just a drop in the bucket. It is thousands of people that we're talking about, and so in an individual level, it's very significant for them in their individual lives. But when we're talking about over 1 million people migrating to the US every single day, what is 2,000 people? What is 10,000 people or 56,000 people? It's really nothing, right? When we talk about the amount of people that are migrating. And not only that, but when you add someone onto our community, it's not just a drain of resources. They become part of the community, right? And still to today, the argument is, why allow me to stay here if we should take care, quote unquote, of the 11 million that are undocumented in this country. And I'm thinking, I don't need to be taken care of. Just let me be. And let me contribute to my community, and not only through taxes, which, by the way, I pay a lot more than 10 times taxes than the president. And let me let me volunteer and make my community better. Let me improve on the place that I've already see as a home that I love and that I see myself be a part of. No one comes here with the intent of causing harm to this country. Right. And those of us that already live here, whether undocumented or not, I think every single person in this panel is invested in this country, in this home. I don't want terrorists in this home. I don't want drugs across the border either. I want my mom, I want my siblings to be in Chicano Park and enjoy themselves without thinking that there's going to be a terrorist attack or drugs around. And so we are all invested in this. And I think people that are coming so desperately, leaving their home, fleeing from violence, what they want is a little bit of respite. They want a little bit of hope to even survive. And so when they do that, perhaps they might need a place initially. But when you talk about immigration, it's not just a one-day kind of thing, right? We're talking about the long term and how we see ourselves as a country, and how we see ourselves leading, and we should be leading human rights efforts. We should be the country that people turn to as an example of hope. And instead, we deviated from that immensely. And the idea that we're going to be a drain on the system is just another talking point by people that are afraid of foreigners, people that are afraid of brown and black people. Because when you talk about 1 million people migrating, 50,000 people is just a drop in the bucket. And these are 50,000 workers that we're talking about. These are families that we're talking about. And so once we all become part of the community, I think as we move along, less and less the concern is, how do we support these folks?
A question on DACA for you. I know we're pushing now to reinstate DACA, and I know Obama did that, but he also tried to add the families to it. And that part, I don't think ever moved forward. In my mind, the families are equally important, especially those who've been in this country for a long time, are working, and they need to keep the families together. Is that something you will be also pushing forward, not just the DACA kids, but their families?
Absolutely. The irony was that Trump migrated his in-laws through that, right? What he calls what we call family reunification, and he calls chain migration, right? And he's like, with one person, you can bring 100 people, and it's like, really, tell me how? Because as an immigration lawyer, I don't know how to do that. But I think the in-laws is what screwed it for the rest of us, you know. And that's the irony that, I mean, and it was quite visible. If you come from a certain country, you will, you know, if you're a European, blue-eyed, white, you're gonna be here in the US whenever you want. If you are a brown, Black person, you're gonna probably be put in a detention center. And that's the system that Trump created, you know, to oversimplify it. So no, we don't want to pass to citizenship only for DACA recipients, because my parents have been part of this community as much as I have. And somehow, without knowing English, without a social security number, my parents figured out how to pay taxes in the 80s with an individual tax ID number. You know, the old president doesn't pay enough taxes, and my parents figured out how to do it 3 decades ago. And they still don't have a path to citizenship. And so that was one of the bargaining chips that this administration was holding on. They were saying, we're not going to protect DACA recipients unless we attack the parents, and unless we bring in more militarization to the border. And we know that's going to result in death. That's going to result in our parents being deported, being put in a detention center. And so we stood our ground and we said no. And that's why we continued with our effort in courts, because if Trump was going to not protect us and dismantle the program and attack us, and we weren't willing to compromise with our families, then we had no choice but to sue. And luckily we won. But with this new administration coming over, I think the chances are that we might be able to protect our families as well, and not have to compromise with increased border militarization, or continuing with the wall. Those were the pillars that this president was asking for while we were having our DACA talks in Congress. Every time we would knock on a congressional office that was held by a Republican, they would tell us, oh, sure, we'll protect DACA recipients. We want you guys here, but we're going to dismantle family reunification. We're going to get rid of the visa lottery, which a lot of Cameroonians and Haitians were benefiting from, and other African countries were benefiting from. This visa lottery, which only, again, allows for 55,000 visas a year on a lottery system. So it was the diversity system. Trump wanted the wall. Obviously, that was going to cause more deaths here and an impact on our environment. And you know, this, and every time I think it would increase some the kinds of policies that they're willing to use to hurt our community. And we stood our ground and we said, no, as DACA recipients, we're not going to let a wall be put up just to protect us, or bring in more border patrols, or get rid of the visa lottery, or hurt our parents.
Okay, we need to move on soon. Is there anything else pressing?
I have a question. I have a
Yeah,
question,
Maggie, yeah.
and it's Jane's question. Who in our California congressional delegation have you found to be particularly helpful or influential on issues of immigration?
Oh my goodness, Kamala Harris in the Senate. I jumped when we heard she was going to be VP, because she was one of the folks that stood ground when the discussions on DACA and the wall were happening. And she's the one that said, no, we're not going to build the wall to protect DACA recipients. And she had a listening ear in our community, even when other Democrats were willing to put up the wall. You know, we saw one congressional representative come from Illinois and say, I have the bricks ready to protect DACA. And we're like, no, don't do that. You know, like, have a listening ear in our community. And so in the Senate, now moving on to the VP office, Kamala Harris definitely has been a champion for DACA recipients in our immigrant community in our border. And she's come to see and visit the detention center here as well. Locally, Juan Vargas has been pretty still, and I mean, really hasn't done much. I would say nothing really. Susan Davis was pushing at some point for DACA protections, but she's going to be retiring. Scott Peters has been very vocal about DACA recipients, but not really moved anything. So we have all these folks that are in support of, but not really moving things. And that has been the issue, that they keep dismissing us. And at one point, Dianne Feinstein, dismissed us because we're not voters, right? I can't vote. But again, now we have proven we can't vote, but we can register people to vote, and we can get other people that love me and support me, that want to keep me here voting in our favor. And so locally, they all quote unquote support us, but actually moving things and introducing legislation, that's yet to be seen. Again, Scott
About
Peters.
11.
Yeah, I mean, they vocally support us, but in Congress, not really doing much to move things, to introduce bills, to keep this at the forefront. At one point when the Parkland kids were in Congress, and we were there that same week, that we were told, oh, we're going to have to take care of the Second Amendment before doing anything with you guys, because that's now, at the forefront. And we were like, oh, you can't walk and chew gum at the same time. And look what happened. They didn't fix anything with the Second Amendment, and they didn't fix DACA. So, there's a lot of quote unquote vocal support out there, but actually doing things on the ground is yet to be seen.
Yeah, I think they feel blocked by the Senate. But all right. Well, Dulce, this is incredible. This has been wonderful, and we sure appreciate your time.